Quickly, before we begin, most of you will be aware that I was banned from YouTube and that this video is a re-upload. I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching and that the journey shall now continue on Rumble. Now more than ever, I should be much more reliant on your kind donations and subscriptions so that I can keep making these videos. So, if you enjoy this video, or if you've learned from my videos in the past and had ever considered donating or subscribing, then please do check the link in the description and sign up if you just want to support me or join our private Discord and Telegram. Thank you. In the popular imagination, Germany's invasion of Russia, the biggest in history, is put down to Germany's desire to conquer the world and acquire Lebensraum for the German people. But is that really the case? In the modern day, we love to put wars down to nonsensical reasons, and that's what fills the popular narrative. Only few, with the desire to read into any war, truly understand why a war begins and how it gets to that point. In more recent times, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, whether you agree with it or not, is put down to Putin trying to restore the Soviet or the Imperial Russian borders of the past, totally ignoring the years of build-up to that war. World War II itself is put down to Germany just wanting to take over all of Poland, and that Hitler himself wanted a war with France and Great Britain, which holds no basis in fact. Every war has a cause and a build-up. The Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russia, is no different. When the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in 1939 and Eastern Europe was carved up into two, as much as it may have seemed like it, this wasn't just bold aggression. The Allies, led by Winston Churchill, had attempted to court Stalin. If this came off, Germany's greatest fear may have been realised: a two-front war. To prevent this for the time being, they had to beat Great Britain to the punch. In reality, the Allies completely fumbled their attempt to woo Stalin, even angering him in the process by making it seem like a big joke. They sent an old steamer boat with their diplomats which took 6 days, as opposed to simply flying. National Socialism and Communism were probably the least compatible ideologies on the planet, and the world was shocked when the two signed the pact. Given the scenario though, Hitler had no choice. He could secure his right flank, given the fall of Poland, and be free from the dreaded two-front war. Besides, Germany in 1939 never would have stood a chance against the might of all the Allies, plus the Soviets combined. Hitler had signed a rough deal to secure this, however. The Baltic peoples and the Finns, whom he thought extremely highly of, were assigned to the Soviet sphere of influence, and Stalin was handed over far more land than Hitler got in the end. Worst of all, he had to explain to his hardcore anti-communist allies why on earth he'd just done such a thing. Mussolini was perplexed. Stalin, however, had just won the lottery. He got all the territorial gains and more that Germany had gotten, except with absolutely none of the consequences. By the outbreak of war in 1941, Stalin and Hitler had both invaded 7 sovereign countries each. The regret was almost immediate for Germany. The Germans were quietly cheering on the lack of progress the Soviets were making in Finland, but publicly could do nothing to help. As the war progressed, the Germans kept offering to mediate an end to the war, annoying Stalin greatly. Allied pressure on the Soviets to stop the madness was mounting, and eventually, Stalin backed off and signed a peace deal with Finland, taking a decent chunk of land in the process along with other demands. Russian resource and food shipments to the Reich as part of the pact began to be delayed or held up completely, and Stalin was taking his sweet time to return his collection of German POWs that he'd taken from his half of Poland. But suddenly, Stalin's mood did a 180, and all that changed. Without realising it, Hitler had saved Stalin. When the Allies were beaten to the punch yet again in Norway, Stalin's northern front was secure. The Allied designs on the resources of Norway and Sweden had come to nothing. The communist parties under Stalin's orders in both France and England had denounced the invasion as blatant imperialism. But it wasn't just this. Hitler had changed the course of history more than anyone would realise until later. The Allies, working with Turkey, had planned to bomb the Baku oil fields, and this wasn't just theory, it was ready. The scouting had been done and had shown how weakly defended the Soviet oil operations were. In fact, they were a powder keg. The whole area would go up in flames with a pretty small amount of bombs. When Germany marched into France though, that all changed. All that mattered to the Allies was saving Paris, and all the key players were thrown back home for more important matters. On top of that, Chamberlain, who was ready to intervene in Finland along with Italy and France, had been replaced by Churchill, the former #1 anti-communist but now desperate war leader who would stop at nothing to defeat Germany. The Allies had gone from seeking an alliance against Hitler to on the verge of declaring war against Stalin, and then right back to desperately seeking an ally again. With Paris fallen, and the Allies in no position to stop him, Stalin moved into the Baltic states, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. Apart from the horrifying occupation with tens of thousands meeting their doom or being shipped off to Siberia, the banks were systematically looted from the state level, along with all their foreign assets, including 330 million Reichsmarks worth of Germany's. Next up was Romania. Stalin wanted control of the Danube Delta to maintain his control over the Black Sea. He was also incredibly interested in Turkey for this same reason also. Bessarabia and North Bukovina were demanded from Romania on incredibly flimsy claims with an incredibly small deadline to move out, or a state of war would be declared. They didn't even stick to this and moved in sooner, but the Romanian army managed to withdraw in time, albeit in a great hurry. Thousands fled, but not enough. The same story as the Baltics followed. By the end of 1940, 300,000 Romanians had been deported to the gulags in Siberia, many never to return. The banks were looted, again with German assets. Transylvania had effectively been split in two, and now the Soviets sat on the entrance to the Wallachian Plain, the route directly to Hitler's main source of oil in Ploiest. Romania's luck got worse as the Hungarians and the Bulgarians, taking advantage of their weakness, mobilized on the border, seeking their own lands back. Romania begged for Germany's help. The territories were settled with Bulgaria and Hungary, and Germany proclaimed a guarantee on Romania's new borders. The new fascist leader and ardent anti-communist, Ion Antonescu, invited the Germans to secure the country for him, and Hitler's oil. Antonescu insisted on paying for the occupation, despite Hitler's offer to do so for free. 100 million lei a month was paid to the Germans to keep troops there. The issues didn't end here, and endless border clashes continued, initiated from both sides on the messy border covered with islands at the mouth of the Danube. Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia all came knocking on Hitler's door to sign the Tripartite Pact. Europe was clearly drifting into two camps, and no one wanted anything to do with Stalin's communist regime. Stalin's next target was Bulgaria, and more importantly, the Black Sea, which Turkey controlled the access to. At first, Stalin tried bribing Bulgaria to jump on board with him and carve up Turkey, promising them territory in Yugoslavia, Greece, and Thrace from Turkey. Instead, they were driven into the arms of Hitler, if they weren't there already. Bulgaria immediately came to Hitler for help. Stalin began harassing the Bulgarians to effectively become a vassal state under Soviet military occupation. The Bulgarians stalled for time. In a strangely funny episode, 600 letters suddenly appeared on the Bulgarian leader's table from citizens, all requesting Soviet troops be stationed in the country, but they were all quite clearly written by the same person, aka the Soviets. Instead, Germany sent troops in plain clothes into the country to figure out what was going on, before being invited directly by Bulgaria to station normal units there. Hitler began supplying Bulgaria with the means to defend their coast. At the same time, massive troop buildups were being reported on the Soviet side of the Romanian border. In effect, a first Cold War was happening. The smaller states were having to pick a side and being influenced by one or the other. However, with the track record of the Soviet Union, they all wanted to hop on board with Hitler's Reich, for better or for worse. Finland's elections were being meddled with, and they were effectively given an ultimatum to install the candidates the Soviets wanted, or it would be seen as hostile. German troops were pouring into Finland, officially to guard the nickel deposits. First it was Romania, then it was Bulgaria, and now it was Finland. Each state was getting its turn. The Finns were only ever going to choose one great power to attach themselves to in this situation, and it certainly wasn't going to be the Soviets, who had just killed 26,000 of their countrymen in a war less than a year prior. To calm things down during all this, the Soviet Foreign Minister, Molotov, was invited to Berlin to discuss the signing of the Tripartite Pact officially. Instead, Molotov spoke extremely aggressively to Hitler and eventually issued him what seemed like an ultimatum. Stalin would sign on 5 conditions. 1. No German troops in Finland. 2. Soviet military occupation of Turkey. 3. Recognition of the Persian Gulf as a Soviet sphere of influence. 4. Japan must renounce its claims on North Sakhalin. 5. Bulgaria to effectively become a vassal state to secure Stalin's Black Sea control. Hitler was absolutely furious. Stalin and Molotov couldn't have put it any more clearly. There was only going to be one winner in this Cold War for Europe. Negotiations were pretty much off the table, and neither side trusted the other. Anyone who thinks Soviet-German relations were rosy up until the invasion, and then Germany just suddenly invaded, is sorely mistaken. More generally, Germany wanted to avoid 2 things: starvation and a 2-front war. In the First World War, Germany was starved to death by a British naval blockade. Even the end of the war didn't stop it. It was enforced even afterwards as a way to make Germany give in to harsher and harsher demands. Between 500,000 and 800 civilians starved to death. This needed to be avoided, but where would the food come from? Currently, the Germans were dependent on imports from the Soviet Union, and there was only one place in Europe sufficient to produce enough food for the German people if things got worse: Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe. Conveniently, this would also solve the German problem of a 2-front war, if, and it's a big if, they could pull it off quickly. If the Soviets could be knocked out by a swift blitzkrieg move just as in France and Poland, they wouldn't have to worry about a 2-front war when the Allies landed, which they inevitably would. It was only a matter of time until the US joined the war. Roosevelt was hell-bent on intervening, so the time to strike was now. The Soviets needed to be gotten out of the way so the Reich could take not only their food, but also their resources necessary for the war into their own hands. Why wait on Stalin's unreliable shipments when he could change side at any moment? Self-reliance was a must. If the Allies landed and gained a foothold, it was only a matter of time before the Soviets took advantage and flooded over the eastern border. The German dependence on the Soviets was staggering. They were essentially an economic vassal of the Soviets. If the Soviets chose to turn the tap off, the supplies would stop, and the German war machine would cease to function. Very little was under Germany's control. The nickel and timber from Finland and the oil from Romania was all they had any real control of, and the Soviets were moving in fast. The Soviets had seized the strategically important areas of Bukovina and Bessarabia, and Ploiest, where the Romanian oil was entirely at their mercy if they so chose. Soviet air bases littered the border, and if they wanted to put the German war machine out of action, they could. How could the German Reich remain a serious great power if they didn't even have command of their own resources? There was never any question. If it was going to be a long war, they needed to move east. In 1940, Churchill had refused to surrender and Hitler's quick war was blown up in his face. He never even wanted to fight Britain or France, but now here he was in a war which he had no realistic prospect of ending. Churchill was happy for the British people to endure the war conditions for as long as was necessary for him to get his victory. He felt it was inevitable that Roosevelt would drag the USA into the war, but he also felt that Stalin and Hitler would fall out, and war would break out between those two also. Anyone could have seen that coming a mile away. They could not predict when, but it would come. So he waited. Germany had to keep their war machine moving, and so as time progressed, they became more and more dependent on the Soviets. Churchill was right to expect that the agreement between Hitler and Stalin wouldn't last long. Both Hitler and Stalin knew this to be true also. Everyone was playing for time. Hitler to get Britain to surrender so he could focus on the real enemy. Stalin to build up his forces for a huge move into Europe. Churchill for Roosevelt and Stalin to get involved. The Germans were running out of time. Ever since the founding of the Nazi Party, Hitler had been at war with communism. The two ideas were opposites. One, hyper-nationalistic, the other, although toned down by Stalin to socialism in one country, as opposed to Lenin's permanent world revolution. Hyper-expansive and hyper-multicultural. Just because communism was going to remain centered on one country, that didn't mean that country wasn't going to expand. There was no way the two worldviews could coexist. Hitler's allies were furious with him when he first made common cause with Stalin. Christian Europe hated communism, and rightly so. The horrors were obvious for anyone to see. There was only so long that Hitler could hold back on attacking the real enemy that everyone was itching to take down. The Soviets were on the same page. They too knew war was inevitable. Between 1939 and 1941, the biggest military build-up in human history was underway, conveniently glossed over by historians to make the German attack seem like a huge surprise. Reports were flying in from both sides of frequent border violations occurring as scouting planes flew over on endless fact-finding runs. Spies endlessly told Stalin that an attack was inevitable and vice versa with Hitler. Dates were given and it didn't come to fruition. It was impossible to predict a date, but everyone knew it would come one day. In 1939, the Soviet army stood at 1.9 million men. In 1941, it stood at 5 million. In 1941 also, there was 251 new air bases built by the Soviets. 199 of them, 80%, were within half an hour's flying time from the Reich border. The heaviest build-up was in western Ukraine. The target was obvious, the Romanian oil fields. All Soviet war plans were focused here, and moves were planned to charge into Romania in a gigantic movement and seize the fuel for Hitler's war machine. This was confirmed later when the war plans were found. All the pre-war Soviet war games were focused on this same task. The infrastructure build-up in western Ukraine was underway on a massive scale, but this wasn't defensive like a Soviet version of the Maginot Line. This was offensive. Gigantic tank parks, fuel depots, and air bases were constructed. Railways were set up, except not with the Soviet rail gauge. The European gauge was used so they could move westwards. The Soviet production of tanks and planes dwarfed every other country by a mile. In the Winter War in Finland, a minor event to most in the history of the war, the Soviets used more planes than both sides did in the Battle of Britain combined, one of the most famous events of the war. Hopefully this video displaying just a handful of the reasons why the two sides went to war sheds a little more light on the situation than the usual Hitler wanted living space argument put forward by most books or videos. The reality is that both sides knew what was coming, just not exactly when. Hitler knew he couldn't remain in a situation where he was dependent on the Soviets for long, and time was running out. If anything, he didn't have a choice. He could invade now and try to knock the Soviets out quickly, or once the Allies landed, he could be crushed by a gigantic Soviet move when it was too late, and the Soviet build-up had made them near indestructible. Hitler wasn't insane. The attack on the Soviet Union was perfectly sound, although unrealistic in its objectives. To expect the blitzkrieg tactics to work as well on the Soviets as it had against the French or the Poles was expecting too much, especially to pull them down in one move before winter. Winter clothes weren't even packed or prepared. Perhaps the successes in the West had made Hitler far too optimistic, like a gambler who's on a lucky streak. He felt this could only end one way. Stalin was more than happy to negotiate later on when defeat was staring him in the face, but Hitler felt the Soviets had to be destroyed once and for all, and he was probably right. Maybe there was no way he could win, but he had to try, and sitting on his hands, waiting for the Allies to land while he became more and more dependent on the Soviets wasn't an option. A war in the East was inevitable.